In this History Bite, we're going to talk about a military arms race, defined as a competition between nations for the superiority or the development and accumulation of weapons. When we think about military arms races, we usually think about the 20th century and the Cold War. Nuclear bombs, AK-47s, and a whole bunch of battle tanks. So many battle tanks. The American Patton, the Soviet T-72, the German Leopard tank. There were so many tanks. However, there were arms races long before the Cold War. For example, the Bronze Age saw a race by various empires of the Middle East to acquire a source of bronze for their militaries. But before the age of modern warfare, a battleship arms race, which occurred in South America at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, is perhaps one of the most interesting arms races. It was the only arms race that we know of fueled in part by animal poop, but this arms race in particular makes us think about the reason for and the long-term consequences of such a rapid military buildup. The story of this arms race begins with the young nations of Chile and Argentina near the end of the 19th century. Like so many rivalries, it began with a question of territory. You see, by the mid-1800s, the southern portion of South America, referred to as Patagonia, had not been explored or claimed, though it was home to some 20,000 Native Americans, known as Mapuche. Both Chile and Argentina claimed this land. Both sent expeditions and explorers to stake their claims, and both sent settlers to claim the land, much like the American West. Now, in 1850, Argentina had the largest navy of any South American country, but it was Chile who kicked off this arms race, when in 1887 they placed an order for the creation of the battleship Capitaine Prat. Weighing at 6,800 tons, it may not have been the first iron ship in South America, but it was the largest and had the most firepower. Argentina, seeing this development, was not to be outdone, and the very same year, the government of Argentina placed an order for several smaller iron battleships, including one, Independencia. While much smaller than the Prat, Independencia and her sister ships would help balance the power of the Chilean navy. Despite this, Chile had a distinct advantage over Argentina during the race: large deposits of in-demand natural resources. Argentina, on the other hand, utilized loans to pay for many of their ships, a fact that was often protested by many Argentine newspapers as the race went on. In particular, Chile had large deposits of a material known as guano. Guano is the fossilized remains of bird and bat droppings. Before the advent of chemical fertilizer in the 1920s, this was the best way to increase crop yields. 3 years before the arms race began, Chile had just concluded a war known as the War of the Pacific with both Peru and Bolivia, taking control of large fields of guano along the coast of South America. Chile opened up mining facilities, imported laborers from China, and the net income into the Chilean treasury from the first year of guano mining increased its revenues 900%. Between the years 1887 and 1902, Argentina and Chile combined ordered a total of 21 iron battleships and cruisers. Now I say ordered, not built, because neither Argentina nor Chile had the industrial capacity of the time to build these massive iron ships. No, they were built by private firms in Great Britain and the United States. It is interesting to consider the economic path this put Chile and Argentina on. Exporting raw materials was the economic lifeblood of South America long before this arms race, dating back to the colonial era. The silver mines of Potosi come to mind. However, the sheer cost of some of these ships, such as Argentina's Independencia, which may have taken up 15% of Argentina's export profits during the year it was ordered, was simply staggering. It was true that Argentina spent money to improve public infrastructure via the export of their resources, but one has to wonder if this arms race and the ease with which they could acquire military technology by simply exporting resources, or the ease of loans from Great Britain or the United States, slowed the growth of these nations' industrial development. Instead of investing in their own shipbuilding yards, which may have taken years to construct and required years of training for their citizens, they simply paid the price and got the finished product now. How much of this, one has to ask, was panicked buying versus a measured response to a political rivalry? That said, the rulers of Argentina and Chile did begin to realize the financial burden of maintaining the arms race. In 1902, with mediation from Great Britain, they signed the Pax of May, in which they divided Patagonia between them along a border which already reflected the settlements and military outposts in the region. More importantly, they agreed to stop building new battleships. And just like that, it seemed as though the arms race was over. Zooming out from South America, the early 1900s were a critical time in naval history. In 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Tsushima Strait, destroying their entire fleet and signaling the rise of Japan as a great naval power. In 1907, the United States dispatched their Great White Fleet, a flotilla of 16 battleships which visited foreign capitals around the world, demonstrating American naval power. To top all of this off, in 1906, the British introduced the battleship Dreadnought, the first of a new class of iron battleships that would renew the naval arms race, not just in South America, but around the world. The Dreadnought was a revolutionary battleship, in part because of its concentration of firepower into fewer but much larger guns. For example, the Dreadnought had 10 12-inch caliber guns, versus Chile's Captain Prat, which had 32 guns of various smaller sizes. During the first arms race between Chile and Argentina, Brazil, to the north, had been undergoing 10 years of political turmoil from the end of slavery in 1888, followed by the abolition of the monarchy in 1889, and then a number of internal revolts that lasted years were finally ended in 1904. For the politicians of Brazil, a strong naval building project would give the country an object to rally around after the years of turmoil. A number of congressmen in the new Brazilian Republic joined the Liga Marítima Brasileira, the Brazilian Maritime League, to pressure their fellow congressmen to purchase more ships and appropriate funds to increase the size of the navy. This brings to light the question of the value of a military, not just for external defense, but for internal cohesion of a country. That is, using the military as an institution to rally the people around. Historically, we do see this trend in South America, though we see it in other places too. Scholars have pointed out how an external enemy can help to unite a state, but a nation does not need an immediate external enemy if it has a central institution to anchor themselves in. Consider the United States, which was united by its institutions and its constitution for much of its early history. However, it is also worth pointing out that governments which pursue military buildup run the risk of succumbing to their very military via a coup d'etat. This was to happen several times in all three countries involved in this arms race during the 20th century. In fact, during this arms race that we are discussing, the government of Brazil, while technically a republic, was under the heavy influence of the military. Several former generals held high positions in the government, and almost every president had some connection to the military apparatus. Does the influence of the military lead to an arms race, or is the arms race the result of a strong military influence? Regardless, Brazil, like its neighbors, also lacked shipbuilding infrastructure. And much like that of Chile with its guano fields, Brazil was a major supplier of an in-demand industrial component, that of rubber, as well as coffee. To the industrial economies of Europe and the United States, Brazil supplied perhaps 90% of all their rubber supplies before 1905. And coffee was such a large export product that the First Republic is sometimes referred to as the government of café com leche, the government of milk and coffee. These resources would allow Brazil to pay for their new ships. In 1906, Brazil ordered not one, not two, but 3 of the new Dreadnought-class battleships from firms in Great Britain, increasing the size of the budget for the Navy by 600% in a single year. The largest of these 3 ships, the Minas Gerais, with an almost 1,000-man crew and coming in at 21,000 tons, was the equivalent of 3 Captain Prats, with more guns than the Dreadnought. For a brief moment, these 3 dreadnoughts combined made Brazil the 4th largest navy in the world, and the most powerful navy in the Americas. When the Minas Gerais sailed into Rio de Janeiro in 1910, one newspaper reported, "All of Brazil saluted the colossus of the South American seas, the concrete expression of the energy of the nation." This was not lost on Argentina and Chile, who resumed ordering ships shortly afterwards. As one Argentine newspaper pointed out, these 3 Brazilian ships could obliterate the combined fleet of Argentina and Chile and have enough ammunition left over to bombard Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. Between 1906 and 1914, Brazil ordered 4 dreadnoughts, and Argentina and Chile ordered 2 each. What finally ended this mad rush for battleships? Well, the answer is World War I. During World War I, British firms were not willing to build battleships for anybody but the British government. One firm even refunded the Chilean government for 2 incomplete battleships, which they then sold to the British Royal Navy instead. And those 2 ships sold to the Royal Navy were the only example of any of these battleships to see major combat. During World War I, though Brazil was an ally of Great Britain, the British Royal Navy rejected the offer to have the Brazilian Navy participate in the North Atlantic, because those ship systems were not in sync with that of the Royal Navy. By the time World War II came around, all of the battleships purchased by these 3 countries were long out of date. Brazil participated in World War II as well. Its navy did not serve in either the Atlantic or the Pacific. Rather, it merely guarded the coast of South America against German U-boats. As none of these battleships ever saw major combat with the navies which purchased them, what was the point? In retrospect, it does seem to make this whole arms race look like a foolish waste of resources on national pride. During the Cold War, the massive military buildup served the purpose of allowing both the United States and the Soviet Union to project their power on a global scale. But not so here. None of the 3 nations played such a role in international politics. No proxy wars waged between them in distant lands funded by their states. No, it seems the real winners of this battleship arms race were the British and American firms who were commissioned to construct the ships and profited from their sales. Brazil may have boosted their national pride, but no Brazilians were employed in the construction of the Minas Chile. Was it really so negative, though? Is it all bad? Is it possible that the reason there was never a major war in South America during this time was that the arms buildup kept everybody from going to war? Possibly. Chile had been the aggressor in the War of the Pacific against both Bolivia and Peru, the victory providing Chile with its future guano monopoly. It is not surprising that Argentina wished to maintain a strong defense, and the argument could be made that since all 3 nations relied on exporting raw materials, it was important to have a strong navy to keep the sea lanes open, and each navy balanced the other out, thus preventing a war. Well, that may be. But what about the long-term consequences of such a rapid military buildup? Large sums of money were invested into these battleships, money that could have been used elsewhere, money that in some cases was borrowed from European financiers, or, more commonly, generated from the export of raw materials. By the 3rd decade of the 20th century, Chile's guano reserves were largely exhausted, although export of what remained did continue. By the 3rd decade of the 20th century, Chile's guano reserves had largely been exhausted, although Chile continues to export small amounts of guano to this day. During both the World Wars and the Great Depression, the economy of all 3 nations took a major hit. The war cut off traditional markets for their goods in Europe, and this is the weakness of an economy dependent on the export of raw materials. The market can be very fickle. And this brings up the question of priorities: industrial infrastructure or military technology? There's also the question of political stability. Is it wise to maintain such a large military force with no immediate external enemies? I mentioned earlier the influence a powerful military can have on a government, but there's also the potential for the reverse. In both Brazil and Chile, these naval forces were involved in revolts against the government. In Brazil, the very same year that the Minas Chile was delivered, it and its sister ship, the Sao Paulo, were involved in an event known as the Revolt of the Lash. A revolt led by predominantly black servicemen, some of whom were former slaves, seized control of both ships, sailed them out of the harbor, and threatened to bombard Rio if the practice of using a whip to discipline sailors was not abolished. Despite the idea that these battleships would unify Brazil's diverse population, instead the divide between the predominantly white officers and the predominantly black sailors of the Navy seemed to demonstrate the lingering class conflict within Brazilian society. And in Chile, in 1931, a revolt was in part sparked by the government's insolvency from the extensive borrowing it had undertaken to build more ships, and as a consequence, it was unable to pay its sailors. Again, a question of priorities. Who do you pay, the sailors or the battleship manufacturers? These both serve as nice reminders that the number of revolutions that were started by naval revolts, such as the Russian Revolution, the German Revolution of 1918, and the end of the Portuguese monarchy in 1911, all of these revolts were sparked by sailors. But the opposite is also true, as I have stated earlier. Large military forces, including navies, can be a force for political suppression. In Argentina, in the middle of the first arms race in 1893, An effort by a political organization to oust a fraudulently elected politician was suppressed by the Argentine government, using the navy, including the Independencia, to force the rebels into surrender and reinstate a fraudulently elected politician. The South American naval arms race forces us to question the value of having such a large military force. Can a military serve as an effective unifying force for a nation? What are the consequences of pouring such large amounts of money and national wealth and treasure into a military apparatus, both in the short term and in the long term? I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something, but I also hope you've walked away with a few questions. This is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.